Welcome back. Now, in our first segment, we were talking about the planned implosion of America as far as the welfare state is concerned. But of course, there's also a warfare component to that. But to briefly review the article today that was on InfoWars from Michael Snyder, he says the United States of debt. He talks about how the total indebtedness of sovereign debt of America hits $60 trillion. And of course, that's up by a factor of 30 in just the last 4 decades. Now, how do we get there? It's the welfare state as well as the warfare state. But first, again, to recap the welfare state, it's not just a crushing debt. It's also, as he points out, a coming tsunami of demographics with the baby boomers. That's what the Obamacare massive bailout of the insurance companies is about. Think about the bailout of the mortgage companies, and this is essentially the same thing with a demographic surge of medical care that's coming. They want to transfer that to the sovereign debt of the United States rather than have the insurance companies pay for it. And of course, they get a windfall profit in the meantime by selling policies that are way beyond what anybody needs. For example, a single man being required to have maternity coverage. So that's one aspect of it. We also have massive unemployment. Now, they use a different term for that now. They talk about people who are out of the workforce. They're not participating in the workforce because they've redefined unemployment. They need to come up with a different number. But of course, in 36 years, this is the lowest it's been of people who are participating in the workforce. That's the easiest way. That would have been called unemployment in years past. But the main thing is the warfare business. And we see that in the collapse of Iraq. What is that costing us? Well, as Kurt Nemo points out today on Infowars.com, the war industry stands to make billions off of the ISIS threat. He says in the war business, timing is everything. And just last month, it was announced a few outstanding members of the military-industrial complex would stand to rake in about $1 billion if an arms sale to the Iraqi government was approved by Congress. Considering the current situation in Iraq and alarm bells echoing through the halls of Congress, the sale will undoubtedly go through without a hitch. And he gives several examples. Beechcraft Defense Company standing to gain $790 million. AM General is going to sell Humvees to the total of about $101 million. Raytheon with a $90 million deal. And on and on and on. So the question is this incompetence or is this by design? We've seen weapons transferred to al-Qaeda terrorists in Syria from Benghazi. We've seen weapons transferred to al-Qaeda terrorists in Syria from Iraq itself. And now those equipped and trained al-Qaeda terrorists, those that Dennis Kucinich and Ted Cruz said we were going to act as the Air Force for al-Qaeda in Syria. Now those Syrian al-Qaeda, with the weapons and the training that we've given them, are now going into Iraq. It is part of a planned takedown. Now, I've listened to a lot of mainstream conservative radio hosts talking about how this is an existential threat to the Middle East, saying it's an existential threat to America. In other words, it threatens the very existence of America, what's going on with ISIS. Well, it does, but in a very different way. It threatens it by the bankruptcy of America, by turning this military-industrial complex loose on the American public. Just look what they spent on these boats. The U.S. spent $3 million on boats for landlocked Afghanistan. That's right, $3 million for just 8 patrol boats. And they make this point, and the Washington Post is making this point. Number 1, Afghanistan is landlocked. Number 2, not a single boat has arrived in Afghanistan, even though they bought them 4 years ago in 2010. And look at this, the third thing. Even though you could get these boats for $50,000 in the United States, and I think looking at those boats, that's a pretty high price, they bought them for $375,000. And then the Washington Post goes on to say, it remains a mystery why the boats were deemed unnecessary so soon after they were bought. In other words, they're not taking delivery on them because they said, oh, they're not necessary. We understand why they were deemed not necessary right after they were bought, because the war was not necessary any more than these boats are necessary. The whole thing is about making money for the military-industrial complex, those people who are paying off the senators to transfer money to them that way. And of course, the entire military-industrial complex is going to metastasize into a surveillance state here in America. It's already doing that. We're already seeing this militarized equipment that is way over the top being brought to America. We see them approving all kinds of militarization of our police at very high expenses, being driven by the federal government and these same industries that have been pushing us to war continuously ever since World War II. Now, what's going to happen in Iraq? We see just recently that the U.S. is now ordering a partial evacuation of the Baghdad embassy as an aircraft carrier is arriving in the Gulf. Now, this is the gigantic U.S. embassy in Baghdad. This is 5,500 people who live there. It's a small city. Nearly $1 billion they spent on this thing. And it looks like a fortress. This is about, as you see that picture there, that's the green zone. And they say the embassy is 104 acres, about the size of 80 football fields. Let's take a look at what this embassy looks like. Now, this is from an article about a year ago from Business Insider, where they're talking about the staggering cost of it. There's part of the embassy inside, but scroll down to that next picture. Look at that, a concrete wall. And that's what reminds me of what we saw at Bilderberg in Denmark. This is a fortress set up to keep everybody out. Why? Because it's an illegitimate government. Listen, when we went to the Asymmetric Warfare Center at Fort A.P. Hill, I had reviewed the speeches and the analysis of people who were fighting the Iraq War, colonels who were there. And they said one of the things that you can tell about whether or not a government is legitimate or not is the amount of money they have to spend on security in order to maintain stability. Go back and take a look at that picture again. That is the picture of an illegitimate government. When you have to surround your embassy with that, you don't have the support of the people. You don't have a legitimate government there. How did they get to that point? Having never given us a truthful, reasonable explanation for why we needed to invade Iraq, why we needed to destroy Iraq, we now have no reason why we need to rebuild that country in the image of the Western bankers. This is an illegitimate government by their own standard of measurement. There's absolutely no reason for us to be there except for the profits that we mentioned earlier, except for the billions that are going to be made by the military-industrial complex, so that we can sell things that nobody needs, like patrol boats in Afghanistan. That's what it's about. But it's also about a secret state. This is something that came up. I found a very interesting story that was linked on Drudge. The secret state, Trevor Paglen documents the hidden world of governmental surveillance from drone bases to black sites. And this is a story from The Independent. Now, this fellow is an artist, but he's also a political commentator. He started out as a map maker, and he started to notice that there were certain areas, and of course he started before Google Maps was out there. He noticed that there were certain areas that were taken off, that were not shown. And that got his curiosity, especially because as a young boy, he was traveling around with his father to different military bases, and he talked to a lot of people that were involved in black ops. So he started following this secret world, and he takes very distant pictures, as you just saw there, pictures with very long lenses of these secret military installations. And this is what he had to say, and I thought it was very similar to what we were doing or trying to do at Bilderberg with our coverage of it. He says he's trying to show us a world not as the media presents it, but as it is. And that's a world in which official secrecy has never been so well entrenched, ubiquitous, or extravagantly well funded. Boy, when I read that, it made me think of Bilderberg. You know, we show up, we can't hear what they're talking about inside. We can just get pictures of them from the outside, but we're there to document the fact that they're doing it, that they're there. It's a very important thing. And he also points out why we need to have an open and transparent society. He says about privacy, he says, I think mass surveillance is a bad idea because a surveillance society is one in which people understand that they're being constantly monitored. And when people understand that they're being constantly monitored, they're more conformist, they're less willing to take up controversial positions, and that kind of mass conformity is incompatible with democracy. And then he gives a second reason that it's a very dangerous idea. He talks about the linkage between transparency and civil liberties. So you can't have, if you don't have transparency, you're not going to have civil liberties. You cannot trade off your liberty in order to get security. When you trade off your liberty, you become a slave. You will be part of a security system, but it will be maximum security. And if there is no transparency in government, then you are going to be a slave as well. You're not going to have any civil liberties. That's why it's such a big deal when we go to military bases, when we go to the border, when they put gag orders on people covering the uncontrolled and encouraged immigration, massive immigration across our borders. That is being encouraged both by policy statements and by outright statements from our president and our vice president. And it's a very big deal when they threaten people who are working for Homeland Security, people who are working at the border, when they threaten them not only with employment sanctions, but with imprisonment. We have a society that is descending into secrecy and into tyranny.
From the water table to our soils to the atmosphere itself, our world is becoming more and more toxic each and every day. But it's not just the air outside that's toxic. Indoor air has been shown to have 2 to 5 times higher concentrations of pollutants than even outdoor air. And most Americans spend 90% of their time inside using toxic chemicals within their homes. There are more than 42 million smokers in the United States. Well over 1,000 types of mold and mildew linked to numerous conditions. And don't forget the fact that 6 million Americans live with pets they're allergic to as well. When I began to research these statistics, it was clear to me it was time to start cleansing my lungs in order to combat the toxic environment that we cannot escape, but that we can fight back against. Made with organic and wild cultivated herbs and manufactured in the USA, the new InfoWars Life Lung Cleanse is here in a convenient spray bottle that can be brought with you throughout any toxic environment. Now available exclusively at InfoWarsLife.com or by calling toll-free 888-253-3139.